Hey guys, thanks for joining me on a snow day. Sorry I wasn't at school today, but we're going to we'll start and finish this progressivism lecture. So, it'll come up. Looking at review questions I would have asked you in class, but I'll ask the questions and then answer them myself. What problems existed during the Gilded Age? We saw the rich taking most of the power, most of the wealth in the nation through bad business practices like horizontal integration, the building of trusts and monopolies, and cornering the market so they can set what price they want. So that's economically. Politically, we've got the poor being exploited through the use of political machines and a lot of political corruption. So trusts and these large corporations are bribing senators to push through policies that aren't antitrust. We've got the poor being bribed into voting in many cities, such as in New York City and Tammany Hall, and the Tweed Ring that we talked about in class. And socially, we've got the degradation of the poor, living in very cramped quarters, not being paid well. So next question, how did they try and fix those issues? Well, we've got some antitrust laws like the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, but just didn't have much teeth, much enforcement behind it. So the government tried to do some things. Socially, many people such as Jane Addams and Hull House and settlement houses, the idea of social gospel, tried to reach out to the poor and help them in that way. And then workers started to fight for their own rights, and we saw a large labor union rising during this time period, during the Gilded Age. So I'm calling this lecture in this part of our Unit 7, Part 1 unit, progressivism, and it's exactly what it sounds like, progress, like moving forward. Let's progress onto a better society, onto a society where the poor aren't exploited and politics aren't corrupt. So progressivism is kind of like the fighting back against those issues of the Gilded Age. So progressivism is not new, but it really takes hold during this time period. The mugwumps, remember, the Republican Party had split into three factions: the stalwarts that kept a lot of those corrupt government policies, the half-breeds, which were kind of in the middle, and then the mugwumps were the major reform party of the day. They were men of social status. They were concerned about the changes in America's politics. They wanted to enact civil service reform, meaning people who get government jobs should have the merit to have those government jobs. But we are seeing during this time period, because people are making more money because they're working, we're seeing a rise of the middle class, and those middle class people see the degradation of the poor. They also want to fight for their own rights, and they're not able to bump above middle class because those rich people at the top are holding all the wealth. So lots of them will join the Mugwump Party as well. Progressives themselves, this is kind of a definition of progressivism. The progressives believe that government should assist with the welfare of its citizens. That government, yes, is for our protection politically, but also for our protection economically and socially. Here is an umbrella idea of what progressives think government should do to protect public interest and restore order to society. So politically, political machines should no longer exist. The government should stop the corruption, the bribery, the spoil system and patronage that's going on in federal, local, and state politics during this time period. And in order to do that, they need to change voting reform. Remember, during this time period, voting was kind of funky, where you walk across the room with a colored card and everyone can see who you're voting for. That will change, because that's the way that lots of people got intimidated into voting for someone that somebody else wanted them to vote for. And we're going to see, just like we talked about last unit, women being more involved in the workplace, meaning that they will be more involved in the political lives as well. And we're going to see the beginning of the female suffrage movement that will culminate in the 1920 19th Amendment. Socially, progressives want to stop the degradation of the poor. They want to improve working conditions for laborers. Remember, during this time period, industrialization and factories are coming to a peak, but there's not much care for the individual worker, because workmanship used to be skilled, like artisans would make things, and well, now things are made on a pseudo assembly line. Anybody can crank that wheel, press that button, hammer in that nail, screw that bolt sort of idea. Employers saw employees as, we can get rid of you. And so working conditions just weren't taken care of by employers. They didn't care about their employees. So they were dangerous and dark and cramped, with chemicals and poor ventilation and possibility of getting hurt in a machine. We also see during this time period like really nasty conditions of food factories. Don't think like food factories of today, but like think the meat packing industry or the cheese making industry of this time period. They're just disgusting. People are consuming those things. We're going to get to that when we talk about Upton Sinclair. Women's conditions as well. Of course, we have labor unions that fight for men's rights, but not many labor unions that fight for the rights of women that are working. And more women are leaving the home. Poorer women are leaving the home and working in the workplace in order to make money for their families. Sorry, my husband is playing Fortnite as we speak over there, that way. We're also going to see people fight for the end of child labor, and that goes hand in hand with people fighting for compulsory school, sending children to school and making it illegal for them not to be in school, which of course cuts down on child labor. Conservation is the idea of protecting the environment, and that's going to be a Teddy Roosevelt progressivism idea, because more industrialism just means more pollution. And prohibition, which is the getting rid of alcohol, which will eventually happen in the 1920s. Economic things that progressives want to push forward is regulating trusts. So deciding what trusts actually build the economy. They're the ones that don't control all of the resources, but still provide jobs and help bolster the economy. And what trusts are bad trusts. So there's good trusts and bad trusts. Bad trusts are the ones that completely corner the market, completely set the price, and make it impossible for small businesses or other markets to rise because they have a monopoly. Consumer protection, same thing as like the whole what are we eating, what's in our food, meat packing industry debacle that we'll get into. Banking reform, should banks charge these outrageous interest rates? Should banks be so willing to give out loans all the time? Remember, part of the reason that we have a panic of 1873 and 1893 and all these panics because banks were over speculating. They're giving out a bunch of loans, trying to make it big, essentially. But they oftentimes people default on their loans during this time period and don't pay them back, meaning the bank is going to fail. So let's set up a reform that stops that. And then labor union reform. The issue of who should strike, when are they allowed to strike, how are employers allowed to treat employees, how should the government respond to major labor union issues. So these are progressive ideas that will be pushed during the time period. The progressive agenda, what progressives will push when they form their own political party, will stem from those issues that we just talked about. So let's zoom in on what some of those mean. Trust we talked about in our last unit. By 1910, wealthy is 2%. So 2% of people own 20% of wealth in the nation. And those 2% are those large corporation trust owners. And when I say oligarchy means that a handful of people kind of own the power. We also, sometimes historians call this a plutocracy, and that's when large numbers of politicians are dominated by trusts in state, local, and federal government, meaning that their votes are influenced by a company that's putting money in their pocket or putting money into their campaign. And the issue of this is it's corrupting the economy because small businesses just can't compete with someone who has cornered the market and who can create a surplus of goods and sell them for less but still make money. And set the price at whatever they want, like Rockefeller and Standard Oil owned 50% of the oil in the nation. They can set the price on oil in a sense. But they're not only just corrupting economics, they're corrupting the government. So that is one issue that progressives really want to target. One of the reasons they're able to get so much power is through political machines. And political machines can be large, federal level, state level, or local level, but the real issue during this time period is the local level. For example, Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall, like we have talked about, the boss controls politics and essentially decides who gets elected into what positions because they target immigrants and hand out jobs and places to stay and money in order to get their votes. They bribe for votes, and their money comes from taxes, comes from the pockets of tax-paying Americans. Federal income tax, not a thing yet, Jordan, but state and local income taxes are currently prevalent. Please be quiet, okay? So immigrants were enticed by these bosses and then vote for who these bosses say to vote for. So yes, immigrants' voices are being heard, but they're not as informed as the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the WASPs, the white people in the city. Jordan. So these local politics are now out of the hands of the white voters, of which they have a problem with. But not only they have a problem with it, but immigrants aren't, many of them aren't well informed of what's going on, so they're not really being represented in the way that they should be. Urbanization and urban sprawl, we hear that term nowadays, but it really is prevalent in this era. This is the beginning of the modern era. So we saw through Ellis Island from 1880 to 1920 about 27 million immigrants come through, mostly through Ellis Island and Angel Island. Yes, lots of them return back, that birds of passage idea that we talked about, but the majority of them will come and stay in cities because cities have the things that they need: jobs, factories, shopping, entertainment. Cities also have new technology in a sense, like plumbing and electricity, street lights. But cities also kind of offer the idea of being anonymous. Yes, you're in a new country, but you can settle in your enclave of people with your culture. Whereas if you moved out into rural America, assimilation was key. So many immigrants stay in the cities because it's there and it's easy. Many rural Americans move to the cities because of the new technology and the job opportunities. And, oh, I'm not doing well out here, let me try and hit it big in the city, in a sense. So because so many people are living in these city centers like Chicago, like Milwaukee, like New York City, like Pittsburgh, Boston, we get these results of urbanization. Tenements are crowded, and I've put a picture here. So you see that this is like a street, and there's a tenement, like if there's a block, there's a tenement here and a tenement here. So if you're living in the back of the tenement, it's a lot worse than living in the front because your windows are literally facing another tenement, and there's not going to be much light or ventilation. Most tenements don't have electricity as fast as the suburbs will have electricity because the landlords just don't want to pay for that. Many families be crowded into small rooms. Maybe not even a bathroom for that family. Maybe there's one bathroom in the whole tenement or one bathroom on the whole hall, or maybe there's no bathroom at all and it's a pot in the corner or an outhouse. The infrastructure of the cities just could not withstand overpopulation. We were building up because of skyscrapers, but that doesn't mean that it was good structurally. That doesn't mean that it was good conditions for those living there. Crime is also going to run rampant when you have lots of people all together. Violence, drinking, gambling, drugs, theft, those sort of things will be extremely common in these parts of the cities, in the poorer parts of the cities. And working conditions aren't going to be that great either. Women and children will be exploited because employers could pay them less. There was no discriminatory laws. First of all, children shouldn't be working, but they could pay children less, and they could pay women less, and they could pay immigrants less than they could pay a white adult male. And so they did that, and that's why they ended up being exploited. Their working conditions were appalling in a sense of getting things caught in machines and poor ventilation, dangerous conditions, like poor lighting, those sort of things, disgusting, breathing in chemicals. And so these labor laws that the Knights of Labor and the American Federation Labor are pushing, yes, we're getting the wheels rolling here, but not fast enough. Not when 30,000 are killed in industrial accidents in New York City in the first half of this next century, the 20th century. So looking back at the progressive era, we are going to see a rise in education. In this time period, end of the Gilded Age, beginning of our period 7 time period, the progressive and imperialism time period, we're going to see that college enrollment increases like 4 times over. So colleges will start focusing on new modern topics, and some of those modern topics include political science, how does the government work? Sociology, how do people interact with each other? How should our society be run? So they apply science principles like the methodology and hypothesis and testing things to studying human life. So looking at how people interact with each other, looking at how people interact with the government in order to solve the problems, the ills of society politically, socially, and economically. And the idea of survival of the fittest and social Darwinism and the rich are rich because they have evolved to be so kind of fades away. I don't want to say fades away, but in the progressives' mind is seen as not the correct theory to apply to the social classes, because people react to their environment and changes in their government in their own way, and they change their laws and customs to fit things, and that sometimes there's disadvantages and consequences of someone's actions make someone else poor, not because that person themselves is less than. So that completely combats social Darwinism. So let's look at muckrakers, of which you have read some of their reading. So I'm going to like fly through these next things. So a muckraker, actually, the term muckraker was meant to be derogatory. It was Teddy Roosevelt talking about, I think, David Phillips. I think we'll get to him in a minute. But he was just trying to make it sound like sarcastic and derogatory, like, why are they doing this? Why are they bringing all this stuff to light? But we look at it nowadays, we look back and be like, wow, they did such a good job. They got in the muck, the nastiness of society, and raked it up and exposed it. But at the time period, it was like a nasty word. You didn't want to be called a muckraker. But now we look back and we're like, good job, guys. So they want to expose the evils of society, and the way that they do so is through journalism. So we've already learned about one, Thomas Nast. He was a cartoonist, and he wouldn't consider himself a muckraker, but we do nowadays. So we look back at him and we see him as someone who exposed the issues with Reconstruction, exposed the issues of the Chinese Exclusion Act, exposed the issues especially of Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall, and actually brought down Boss Tweed and the Tweed Ring because of his cartoons. So during this time period, a lot of books actually started out as articles. People would post a series of articles in magazines like McClure's or Collier's magazine, and Cosmopolitan was actually started during this time period as like an investigative journalist magazine. Wow, things have changed. So this is how most of these muckrakers went about raking up their muck. Jacob Riis is the first. We're going to look at pictures of his in class. Jacob Riis was an immigrant from Denmark, if I am correct. And let me find my notes on him, make sure I get it right for you guys. Riis started out working odd jobs here and there, but finally found his niche as a police photographer. And he was actually very good at using flash photography, which is a new thing for the time period. So cameras are now more handheld during this time period. They still need to be developed via darkroom and those sort of photography techniques. But with the advent of electricity, there's the idea to make it, let's take pictures in the dark. And so he saw, being a crime photographer, he saw these slums, the areas of town where all these crimes are actually occurring. And he got the idea to show the rich and the middle class how the other half lives, which is the name of his book. So he takes these pictures in basements, in cellars, in tenements. He takes pictures of orphans on the street, we're going to look at them, and puts them in this book, goes around the Northeast on a book tour showing everyone what he has found, and people are actually stunned. People that live in the suburbs, people that live in the nice parts of town, people that live in rural areas are like, this is America? This isn't what our principles are. The poor being treated this way is not how it's meant to be. There will be pushback that we can attest to his work, and in New York City they will pass the 1906 Tenement Act, which required a few things of your tenement. You had to have a bathroom for every floor, you had to have an electric light in every hallway, you could only have a certain number of tenants in your apartment. So his book actually led to reform. Lincoln Steffens and the Shame of Cities. It's a book now, but originally it was produced in a series of articles that were like fact-checked. And so Lincoln Steffens' Shame of Cities is in 1902, and the idea is to unmask the alliances between big business and local government. How is big business and these trusts paying off government officials to not pass the things that are going to hurt them? Ida Tarbell, one of our only women muckrakers that we'll learn about in class. She lived this life where her father was trying to break into some of these industries but couldn't because many trusts were blocking the way. So she, in her book, like an expose on Standard Oil, kind of exposes John D. Rockefeller's tactics that to crush competition, to destroy their reputations or buy out their businesses or make it impossible for them to sell their goods. And so she exposes the way this is done, and the government actually investigates Standard Oil and breaks up the trust, shuts them down in 1911, thanks to Ida Tarbell. Sinclair is my absolute favorite. His expose, The Jungle, it's actually a novel, a fictional novel, but it's all based on true things that he experienced. So Upton Sinclair essentially like dressed up, like went incognito, and acted as if he were an immigrant working in a meatpacking facility in Chicago, took notes on everything that he saw. I think it was like a 3-week stint, or maybe it was 3 months. It was 3-something stint of working in a meatpacking facility, took notes on everything he saw, and then wrote a fictional account of a Lithuanian immigrant coming to America named Jurgis, and the horrors that an immigrant has to go through living in America. His wife dies in childbirth. He works in this nasty meatpacking facility where rats and feces and chemicals and people's germs are all up in the meat that is being made, and old meat, and the waste from old meats will just be poured back in, and there's metal and just nasty stuff's being ground up in the meat, and workers are treated terribly. They're caught up in machines. The labor unions are shut down immediately. And so we're going to read some of this in class. Jurgis's child dies drowning in a mud pit on the side of the road. It's just horrible. And all these things are based off of true things that he had seen or experienced himself in Chicago when he worked in this facility. His work actually leads to the same year or a year after two laws about meat inspection and the Pure Food and Drug Act. So meat needed to be inspected before it's taken across state lines. So that's how many of these meatpacking facilities had gotten around the laws that had already been set in place. Well, if you're not going to let me sell my nasty meat here, I'll ship it somewhere else, sort of idea. And the Pure Food and Drug Act will set up regulations that your food has to meet, and it will eventually lead to the FDA that we have today. David Phillips and the Treason of the State articles were written in Cosmopolitan, and then once they were all done, they were compiled into a book. And his whole idea is that he investigated 90 senators, kind of like undercover, and proved that 75 of them did not actually represent their constituents, I can't talk today, their constituents, but rather they were really being bribed by railroads and companies. And David Phillips will actually get shot, like attempted assassination, because of his article and the things that he exposed. And he's the one that President Roosevelt called a muckraker. Like, why are you trying to rake up all this muck and make the government look bad? Again, we take the term as a good thing, but back then it was kind of like, hush, hush, you didn't want to be known as a muckraker. And actually, some of these magazines will go to great ends to fact check their ideas. So Ida Tarbell's book, her articles that will be turned into a book, the magazine she published them in, like, spent thousands of dollars fact checking it before they put it up, because they didn't want their magazine to have a bad name as like a slanderous yellow journalism, it's not true magazine. And lots of magazines after Teddy Roosevelt and the Treason of the State debacle, where he calls them muckrakers and he means it derogatorily, will stop publishing muckraking things because they don't want their magazine to go under to get a bad name. All right, two women I want you guys to know about, two like progressive women, not muckrakers, but people that fight for the rights of those that need their rights fought for. Jane Addams, sometimes known as Saint Jane. So, she is kind of like one of this first generation of college-educated women. So after the Civil War, many women actually ended up going to college, middle class or upper class women. Jane Addams will fight for female suffrage, but she will fight for African American rights through the NAACP. But most importantly, she starts this idea of settlement housing, and settlement housing is a movement that centers around what women are able to do during this time period. Unfortunately, there wasn't much politically they could do, but socially they could help in whatever way they can. So settlement houses were houses near or in the slums set up by middle-class women, where middle-class women go and live there and train and work with the poor immigrants living there. So teaching them English, teaching them basic math or American customs, childcare, job training. A lot of it was faith-driven, like the social gospel idea, faith-driven works. But it was important nonetheless. And Hull House is the settlement house in Chicago, but there were many others in larger cities. Florence Kelly. Florence Kelly investigated and reported on many child labor issues. Florence Kelly lived at Hull House and wrote down everything that she remembered from this time period and took great notes about the children she saw that were forced to work because their families couldn't survive. And so they would send their children to work instead of sending their children to school. She was a lifelong supporter of welfare for women, for blacks, for consumers. She fought for consumer protection, so meaning what are we buying, how much is it actually worth, how much are we paying for it, so much so that she fought for, like, the best way, since we as women during this time period couldn't do much politically, the best way to get the message across was through boycotting. Another women's issue during this time period is the Mueller versus Oregon issue, which we're going to talk about in class. We're going to read something on that, and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire disaster that happened, and we're going to talk about that in class as well, so I'll spare you that in this lecture. So many of the progressive political ideas that we see come from the Populist Party and will be experimented with in Wisconsin, and that's why we're learning about Wisconsin government. Yeah, my husband just looked at me. So today we're going to learn about Robert La Follette. Did I say that right? Robert La Follette. No, La Follette, not Lafayette. Okay, so he's a governor of Wisconsin, and then he will make it to the U.S. Senate. And so, as governor of Wisconsin, his idea is to destroy local political machines and kind of clean up the politics of Wisconsin and wrestling away the control of railroads and lumber trusts, because lumber is a major deal in Wisconsin during this time period. He is one of the first of the Republican insurgents who's not one of those Republican old guards who's like spoils system and trusts and laissez-faire economics, let the government stay away from the economy. He is a Republican, much like a mugwump, who thinks very differently, that the government should control the economics to not exploit the poor and to not be infiltrated by bribery of trusts. And he's going to kind of enact a lot of these political reforms in Wisconsin that later on all of America will enact. And where he gets some of his ideas and his gray hair is from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So there's lots of political experiments and a lot of new political science, which is a new modern idea going on at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And a lot of those ideas will be put into in Wisconsin and federally. So here are some of those ideas. The direct primary, that means citizens choose who will run in the final election, meaning that we have an election before the election to like narrow down the candidates like we do. Initiative means that citizens can put forward a bill and it will be voted on in the House or in the General Assembly. Referendum means that on our ballot, we vote for and against laws, and that is allowed in Kentucky. And then recall, meaning it's kind of like we have this person in power, let's elect them out of office, like let's remove them from office, essentially. So I'm going to show you guys a map here. And you can look at this at your well. Now, this is 2010, so some of these things might have changed, but this is initiative, recall, a referendum, whether those things are allowed in these states. All right, more Robert La Follette ideas that were enacted in Wisconsin. The idea, and he will push for this in federal Senate, the direct election of senators. And the idea behind this is state legislators at the time picked their senators that would be sent to the United States Congress. And La Follette knew that representatives and senators were being bribed by these big trusts, by these businesses, and his thought was that if people directly on their ballot elect senators, then that will fight corruption as well. And Wisconsin will be the first state to enact a state income tax. I want to say 1913. That's what I was looking at. Yep. No, sorry. In 1913, the 17th Amendment will be passed, and that will enact a federal income tax. But Wisconsin is the first to do a state income tax. Sorry. Other ideas pushed politically during this time period is the Australian ballot. So we talked about in class, you pick up your color card, you go across, and you vote. The Australian ballot, also called the secret ballot, is not like that. You register at a table, you go to a table, the voting cards are there, you punch a hole, you circle something like that. And so that counteracts the idea of everyone knows who you're voting for, so they can intimidate you. So that's a good thing. It cuts down on voter, corruption in a sense. Unfortunately, it also eliminates those that are illiterate, which is many immigrants as well. Many immigrants couldn't speak English. So party workers couldn't help voters mark their ballots. It wasn't like, oh, you need to vote for this person or you need to pick up this color card. It is, you go to a box and you vote by yourself. So hundreds of thousands of blacks and hundreds of thousands of immigrants who couldn't read or write English were then effectively disenfranchised. So Teddy Roosevelt, sometimes called TR, so when you see TR, it's Teddy Roosevelt. He's sometimes considered the first modern president because he's coming to the presidency during this time period where industrialization has already taken place, but progressive ideas are being pushed as well. He will use his platform to directly influence public interest, and that is sometimes called the bully pulpit. So he uses his pulpit to bully his soapbox, essentially, his power to try and influence what's going on. He is mostly moderate, but he does support a lot of progressive ideas. We look back now and see him as middle of the road compared to our politicians, but for his day, supporting those progressive ideas in the face of these big businesses was pretty liberal. So his campaign slogan and his platform, all wrapped up into one in 1906, is called the Square Deal. Like you hear someone saying you get a square deal on a car, they're saying a good deal. It's good for everyone. It's good for the buyer of the car while still making the seller of the car some money. So his square deal, good for everyone deal, involves the 3 C's, and this is on your Quizlet as well. So controlling corporations, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources. And we're going to dive into examples during his presidency and after of him pushing these things. He will also run for president multiple times. So 1906, let me do math real quick. 1906, 1910, and 1912, but he is unsuccessful in 1912, I believe. I'll fact check. So first issue, an example of his control of corporations is an issue with mining trusts, and the mining market being cornered essentially by these coal companies. This is also called the United Mine Workers Strike, which is what it is on your Quizlet. But anthracite is the coal company name. So the anthracite coal strike, or the United Mine Workers Strike, is so 140,000 workers go on strike demanding a 20% increase in pay and reduction of the workday from 10 hours to 9 hours. And the company just refuses to work with them. They also want fairer weighing of coal. So a lot of working in mines depending on how much you individually mine, and there was some corruption in how much you mine was weighed. The materials you mined were weighed. So the company essentially says, we're not going to negotiate. The president of the company assumed the public would react against the workers because they're not getting coal for their houses, and that there'd be like public pressure for the strike to end. But he was in fact wrong. Teddy Roosevelt, upset with the bad trust of the the coal companies threatens to take the mines and say, I will send federal troops to mine this property if you as the owners do not cooperate with the labor union, do not increase your workers' pay, do not reduce their hours. And so this is an example of Teddy Roosevelt rationalizing, well, the public is in jeopardy because if there's no coal, there's no heat during this time period and winter's coming, but also protecting the rights of workers and trying to control the power of corporations. Roosevelt also establishes a new government part of the bureaucracy, the Department of Labor and Commerce. And essentially the idea is to stop disputes between capital and labor, the owners and the laborers. And they will try and probe businesses and break up trusts, and they will be put into action with the Northern Securities Company, which is a company that's partially owned by J.P. Morgan. It's a railroad company in the Northwest, and essentially they have a monopoly of railroads going out to the Northwest and in the Northwest, things like Seattle, Washington State area. And Roosevelt goes after this using the Department of Commerce and Labor, bringing a lawsuit against them, an antitrust lawsuit, and the Supreme Court upholds it, and Roosevelt will be seen as a trust buster now. His legacy of busting up trust, breaking up trust, and making it possible for small businesses to not only not be exploited by corporations, but actually have a chance at breaking into the business. Later on, the Supreme Court will look at other trusts like beef trust, sugar trust, fertilizer trust, harvester, surplus grain storage trust, and they will be severely regulated by trust legislation, thanks to Teddy Roosevelt kind of starting that. All right, consumer protection. What are people buying? Is it worth the money they're paying for, and is it safe? We already talked about the Meat Inspection Act. The selling of meat across state lines had to be federally inspected and a tax paid for it. The Pure Food and Drug Act, like I said, will eventually lead to the FDA. It prevented mislabeling of foods and drugs. It made many medicines have to have more, I guess, precise labels of what's going on. So that affects grocery stores and pharmacies as well. So the whole meatpacking industry, this is probably one of the best political cartoons to explain what's going on. So we have TR here, and the Capitol behind him, and he has the rake of investigation, and he's going through the meat scandal. So although he is not a big fan of muckrakers, they have brought to light issues that he cares about. Consumer protection. Here's some pictures of the meatpacking industry during the day. Skip, click, click, click. Here we go. Conservation is probably one of Teddy Roosevelt's largest legacies. He was a very outdoorsy man. He was a very strong man. He loved big game hunting. He loved safaris and South America and Africa and all these different places. And so his idea with conservation is he's just appalled at the destruction of timber and natural resources and mineral resources for industrial gain. And so his idea is not, let's stop it all, but more like control our pollution, intelligently use our resources, plant more resources that we can, like trees, promoting nature as recreation, getting outside sort of national parks, and protecting the environment from pollution. This will be done through different public opinion campaigns, different fundraising efforts to build dams for hydroelectric power, which was seen as cleaner even back then, even now, and saving forests and just using resources sustainably. He really did love nature. All right, I fact checked myself. I got my dates wrong earlier. Sorry, friends. Dates don't stick in my head very well. So Teddy Roosevelt had won in 1900. He wins re-election in 1904. I was correct about 1912. He runs in 1912, but he is not successful then. So looking at after Teddy Roosevelt, we kind of looked at both of his terms. Moving on into William Taft here. Taft's style kind of lacked the fire or guts that Teddy Roosevelt had. He was just seen as like staying middle of the road, more old guard, laissez-faire economics, not going to get involved president, which was very different than Teddy Roosevelt, who kind of rode the line of very progressive. So keeping that status quo is kind of what Taft was known for, not like the mugwumps or the progressives of the time. However, Taft is going to be like Roosevelt started this chain of breaking up trust, but Taft really continues it. And Standard Oil, one of the biggest trusts and one of the biggest resources that Americans need, oil and gasoline, is going to be dissolved during his time as president, and that's major. So there's going to be some progressive legislation left over from Teddy Roosevelt's time that Taft will continue, even though he is less liberal, more conservative in this way. Conservation-wise, the Bureau of Mines, a government agency, will regulate how much stuff is being mined from the ground, mineral resources. The Mann-Elkins Act puts telegraphs and now telephones are becoming more popular under control of the Interstate Commerce Commission, so a government organization that's in charge of things that happen across states and the taxing of that and the who makes money off of that. And then this populist idea of a postal savings bank, remember that from the populist era, will actually be put into law. So postal savings bank here is essentially the post office department is allowed to receive saving, like the post office has like a mini bank in it essentially during this time period, where they can receive savings deposits, and they can, like, if it builds up enough in your little bank account at the post office, they can pay interest dividends on it. So 2% per year on such deposits. And this was a populist idea, and now it's a thing. So the Republican Party as a whole is going to have a lot of splitting up during this time period. The Payne-Aldrich tariff has to do with that. Essentially, it kind of reduces the tariff that the Republicans don't like, but there are some taxes add-ons to it. Taft had said he's not going to mess with the tariff issue, but he did. He signed this bill. Progressives get mad, and we're going to see the split of a party. We also have a controversy where the Secretary of Interior takes a lot of land in Wyoming and Colorado that's like public, not like national park, but public land, and he lets corporations mine off of it and make money off of it. And there is an agricultural department head, like secretary of the agriculture department, Gifford Pinchot, I definitely said that wrong, basically criticize him. Taft has this like fake reason for firing Pinchot, which makes Taft look like he's not for the environment, which many Teddy Roosevelt progressives absolutely hate. So Republican Party pushed even further. We will go over this political cartoon in class. But Teddy Roosevelt, he's not even in politics. He's not even in America. Comes back because he hears about this tariff issue and about this conservatism idea, and he comes back and says, essentially, I'm going to run for president again in this new nationalism speech. And we're going to learn about new nationalism. But as a whole, in this speech in Kansas, he talks about the federal government increasing its power to remedy economic and social issues, regulating companies, busting trusts, and taking care of the tariff issue. So election of 1912, we got three people running, essentially. The National Progressive Republican League is formed. Robert La Follette, he's like the leading candidate, and then Teddy Roosevelt says, essentially, the third term tradition, where we're not supposed to have a third term, doesn't apply, because this is important. My hat is in the ring, and you're not in the frame, you're fine. And so the Progressive Party is these Republicans that have split off, and it's called the Bull Moose Party, is like a slang term for it. For the Democrats, we have Woodrow Wilson, and his idea is not new nationalism, it's new freedom. So the new freedom says we need small business enterprise, entrepreneurship, unregulated and unmonopolized markets, states' rights, some trust busting, some social reform, but mostly leave that to states. So Republicans have Taft and the old guard and those non-progressive, very conservative ideas. The Democrats have Woodrow Wilson, who's like middle of the road, more about economics. And then the progressives that have split off from the Republicans, the Bull Moose Party, have Teddy Roosevelt, their fiery former president. Okay? And here are the results. We have Woodrow Wilson will win this election of 1912, and we will have an entire lecture just on Woodrow Wilson. Thanks for listening. Whew, that was really rushed. Have a good snow day.